Alright you guys, so as the title of the video says, I'm going to get straight to the point. I have finally made some progress on my server rig, and one of those progress kind of settings so far has been to improve the cooling of my radiator. Now this is a very standard, really slim radiator that I have right here. It's made by XSPC, and typically these radiators, they don't do the greatest amount of, kind of heat wicking as they could. Unfortunately, due to the small thickness of them, this is pretty much the only thing that I could use. Now, what I found is that getting this graphene coated allows for much better performance of the radiator. It ends up radiating a lot more heat, and that means that its ability to sort of wick away heat from essentially all of the fins and from the water that is running across essentially all of these little channels in here is therefore significantly improved. Now, whether it's going to make enough of a difference for cooling the EPIC 48-core CPU that I finally received for my rig is something that remains to be seen. I will need to do some testing. Now, unfortunately, I have not had time to do back-to-back testing with this unit stock versus it being coated, but hopefully by just looking at the general performance of the unit beforehand versus what I'll be getting in my particular rig, we'll be able to see how much of an actual active difference this ends up making. So with that said, this is not something that is particularly cheap. Basically the whole process cost me somewhere in the neighborhood of around like 180 bucks with shipping included, which means that it actually exceeds the cost of the radiator itself. Now, you might think to yourself, what would be the whole point of doing this if, you ended up essentially buying a whole new radiator for the rig? And unfortunately, it's mainly because there's just no other way for me to get better effective cooling across my setup. Now, something else that I've realized is that, unfortunately, my initial plan of actually basically creating a little distro plate to allow the running of the water basically in a very slim channel outside of this thing, because the way that it's mounted, even with the fans in place, does not allow the basic mounting of actual fittings that I have, means that I actually have to come up with a different solution. So far, my next solution is to actually use copper piping, which is going to be relatively slim. I'm also going to be doing basically a brazing of essentially G by 1/4 inch adapters into that piping, which will then allow for a really slim channel to run basically outside of here and then go into the rest of the sort of server chassis and into my pump. Something else that I've realized is that none of the actual cooling solutions that I had planned as far as the pumps go are going to be able to fit, just because pretty much nobody makes pumps that will fit within a 38 mil chassis. Realistically, I have about 40 mils to play with, so it's more or less about the size of a server fan or a 1U chassis, but at the same time, it still means that I have to get a little bit more creative in terms of the solutions that I'm going to be using as far as the cooling goes. The other part that I'm going to get into in the next video a little bit more in depth is that I've had to unfortunately move away from my original plan of using a 3090 in my particular case, mainly because the provider of the water block that I was going to use, they're called Comino. They make some of the slimmest water blocks that are out there. I'll put some pictures up in the video here so you guys can see. They have especially stopped the production of the 3090 FE water blocks, and unfortunately that is the GPU that I have. Now, they do still make water blocks for the 3090 Ti, but since I have the 3090 right now, buying the Ti really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The bonus is, if I do end up getting the 3090 Ti, is that they have the flat 12-pin connector, or 16-pin rather, and the 3090 FE has the vertically mounted connector, which means that it's actually a taller card overall. But I think at this point, especially given the pricing of the 3090 Ti, it would actually make a lot more sense to go for the 4090 in this case. So that's something I'm saving up for, but probably I won't have that until sometime next summer. So in the meantime, I have decided to instead use my 1070 Katana. Now, the downside here again is that the water blocks for the Katana, which used to be made by Bixkey, are now basically impossible to find anywhere. I reached out to one person on Reddit that still has that water block to see if they would sell it, but it's very unlikely that this person would be willing to sell, as that part is something that's, again, just pretty much impossible to find anywhere. Bixkey have end-of-life that unit completely, so at this point, again, very, very unlikely that that's going to be able to happen. So instead, I've decided that I'm going to come up with a custom solution, and that means a couple of things. Essentially, at this point, I'm going to need to come up with a custom water block for the ram. So again, I'm going to be using some copper piping for that, and then that'll be getting piped into an XSPC super low profile water block, which is normally used for CPUs, but in my particular case, I'm going to be running that on top of the 1070 and along with some liquid metal as the sort of thermal interface material, so that I'm able to get really good heat transfer. And from there, again, more copper piping going back into the radiator, as well as going into another really cool solution, which is that since I don't have any space within the server chassis for basically any kind of water sort of reservoir at all, I was trying to see if I could get away with something that's, you know, really tiny. I even looked at just chaining together a bunch of basically flow meters so that I could have at least some water reserve to allow the unit to take much longer to heat soak. But as it stands, I've realized now that that simply still does not give me the space that I would need, and ultimately, as much as I could daisy chain them, that's not really giving me a whole lot of extra water volume to work with. So what I'm doing instead, on top of the NVMe SSDs that I have that are going to be mounted beneath the 1070, I'm actually going to use an MP5 water block, which is typically used on the back of a 3090 to cool the VRAM. But in my case, it actually gives me enough volume to basically cool all of the NVMe SSDs at the same time. And the uptick here, as well as cooling the SSDs, it will allow me to have a significant amount of water volume that I otherwise would not be able to have. And it'll allow me to do so in a super slim sort of form factor. Now, it's by no means the best water reservoir, but it's the only solution that I've come up with so far. So that's all on the way, and once I have the units basically in hand, I'll be able to show you guys exactly what it looks like. It's going to look really nice, it's going to look really clean, and at the same time, it means that, again, the system will take much longer to reach the heat soak temperature. So everything, including this radiator, will have a little bit of a beefier sort of cooling support across the board. And since I'm going to be using a regular kind of desktop pump, it also means the water flow across the system will be really nice. The only drawback so far is that the outputs from this water block that is by MP5 are 4mm, which means it will be causing a restriction in terms of flow in the system, which is not ideal. But again, when you're building something that's really sort of out of the box like this, you don't have a whole lot of options to go for something else. Now, as it stands, I think that the project is progressing a lot better than I actually hoped. It would be at this stage. I've gotten a number of pieces in place. I've also replaced the heat killer water block that was on my CPU, as it was a little bit too tall. Again, my initial plan of creating a custom distro plate for that basically has kind of fallen through. It's just too much work to be able to get any sort of reasonable benefit out of it. And as a result, I've gone with an Iceman Cooler TR4 water block, which is a lot slimmer profile, and that allows me to run some very standard low profile fittings into the rest of the equipment. And then the last and final piece is that due to the way the piping is going to have to run, the actual sort of cooling plate that sits on top of the VRMs for the motherboard is also going to be replaced. And what I'm actually going to be doing here is I will end up brazing a heat pipe onto that aluminum plate. Essentially, I'll be cutting off all the fins, brazing a heat pipe onto that, and then on top of the heat pipe is going to be what would normally be like a typical sort of motherboard VRM water block. And again, that's going to be braced to the top of that water pipe, and that'll have fittings running into it so that I can have consistent flow across that part of the motherboard, as well as provide some additional cooling and allow a pathway for the essentially water to flow from the CPU to the rest of the components, including the graphics card that's going to be running in here, again, that being the 1070 Katana. So in the next video, I'm going to show you guys more or less all of the pieces mounted in place. Hopefully at that point I will also have at least some of the copper pipe in place as well, and be doing some leak down testing of the block to see just sort of what it looks like. And provided that everything goes smoothly and I'm able to modify my power supply, I should have the system operational with a 500 watt PSU running the whole thing, and we'll hopefully get some benchmarks going as well as see what the performance is like. So hang on until that next video, and I'll see you guys then.